This is Pixelated Audio, and you're listening to Malibu Bikini Volleyball for the Atari Lynx. Alrighty, welcome back to Pixelated Audio, a podcast focusing on game audio, its history, and the people behind it. We're your hosts. I'm Brian, and this is Gene.
Hey, everybody. I realize it's a very odd catchphrase, such as it is. I always say, hey, everybody, when we start these shows. But anyway, we're going to be talking about the game Malibu Bikini Volleyball, which is going back to those retro Baywatch vibes, pretty much.
Yep.
It's a really great little game, actually.
It's the game is okay. Soundtrack is rocking, dude. It's so fun.
Good.
It's super fun.
It's really, really well made. The Lynx can be a little bit harsh, but if people know how to tame it, like our man Paul here does, I think it can turn out really well.
Yeah, the track that brought us in, that was Malibu Volleyball, which is the main theme of the game, I guess.
Yeah.
Someone you hear all the time in the beginning. It's cool.
So let's talk about the game a little bit. Malibu Bikini Volleyball is a 93 beach volleyball game developed by Handmade Software and published by Atari Corporation in North America and Europe exclusively for the Atari Lynx. Wow, that's special, right? You got to get a Lynx. Get that thing, play this game. No, I'm just fine. No, it's actually, it is one of the, the few, I would say, really true originals for the system. But it's a pretty straightforward 1 to 2 player volleyball game. It's 2-on-2. You can play either against the computer or another person if you have the link cable. It's obviously in Malibu, California. Where else would it be? And it's pretty much your typical game modes. You can play a single match or a tournament. But I enjoyed it. I especially really like the graphics. I think it's a really nice looking game.
It looks great. It looks great. And I think, so you were saying 1 to 2 players, but couldn't you link up? I think the Lynx had like where you could daisy chain the cables and you can get up to 8 players. This game, at least 4 players, right?
You can daisy chain. I don't know if it does more than 2 players simultaneous. When I was reading about it, it seemed a little unclear. I think you might be able to do kind of a classic California game style thing where you have people trading off, but I don't know if it's more than 2 in a given match. But still, I mean, even 2 players would be pretty fun. I don't know. I'd have to look at. I honestly, I've never had much.
We're
luck
never gonna know. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
It's fine.
There's gonna be one Malibu Bikini Volleyball person out there that's like, "Oh my god, this is my favorite game in the world." What do you talk? We played it all the time, like 8 players, and there's even more people playing than there are on the court, and I don't know. Somebody
on Atari Age is going to call our ignorance out and be like, those fools at Pixelated Audio.
Well, the game was developed and it was one of several projects by Handmade Software. And they were a small development house that served as first or second party developer for Atari and only produced a handful of games from 91 to 95, pretty much the lifespan, or a little bit later, but then the lifespan of the Atari Lynx. And they did stuff for the Atari systems. Their library includes mostly Lynx titles like Awesome Golf, Power Factor, Dracula the Undead, Jimmy Connor's Tennis, Kasumi Ninja for the Jaguar, and Battlezone 2000, which was their last title in 95.
Yeah, and what's interesting is they were producing a lot of, I would call them original titles. Of what the Lynx had a lot of ports of arcade games, of Atari games, but I should probably have dug this up a little bit better, but I was getting some mixed messages. Was it a first-party studio that they essentially just rebranded to like a bunch of Atari employees and they called it handmade software? So it wasn't like Atari presents an Atari game, just to give it a little bit of separation, or if it was really like a small dev studio, because they only really produced for Atari systems. So I don't know for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that would make sense because Atari had their hands, in the arcade and stuff like that. Second party developer, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right.
There were a couple more games. We pretty much listed the entire library of released games. There were a few that were unreleased, but were released much later through some shenanigans. In the early 2000s, a company by the name of Songbird Productions, which is a little bit like a small-scale limited-run games, and Songbird specializes in physical cartridges of new and reprint games with a focus on Lynx and Jaguar. So they published Loops with a Z. That's hard to actually say, Loops.
Loops.
And that was released in 2004, and Total Carnage, which was originally a Jaguar game, in 2005. So those were slated for release, mid-90s, but by that point, the system was starting to taper down, actually both of them. So they were pretty much production-ready games that just didn't get published for about a decade.
Well, I wanted to mention, too, you said there was a lot of ports to the Lynx. And I think that is okay in the sense because this was one of the forefront in handheld gaming, kind of bringing that console experience, full color graphics and everything like that to the handheld, or to a handheld. And it was like the first time you were able to play some of these titles kind of on the go. And so, porting games or not, I think there was a lot of want there to be able to take this stuff around with you. It's not that the Lynx was a relatively small system or anything. It was quite massive, at least the first iteration of it. But we have some more music here, so let's jump into our next track here. This is Trout Shout. So let's take a listen.
That was the track Trout Shout from the game Malibu Bikini Volleyball, composed by Paul Tonge, who we'll talk about more as the show goes on. But as you'll notice, the first half of that's a little bit more repetitive, but, keep in mind it's meant to be more of a backgroundy sort of thing as you're playing fairly long games of volleyball. But, there are some nice changes, and there's a pretty good variety of music throughout the soundtrack in terms of styles and feels. So this one's a little kind of mid-tempo-y, very, very European.
A little on the darker side. It reminds me of, I don't know. It just has
I know
kind
what
of
you
like,
mean.
a darker feel, yeah.
1992 Euro computer music, let's call it.
Sure.
I think I mentioned it. I can't remember. I'm forgetting. But the first track, since we didn't talk about it too much, definitely just that kind of chuggy eighth note thing reminded me so much of the California Games theme.
Yep.
We're out in the sun, right? Let's celebrate a little bit.
and that was one of my. Well, I'll talk about it later. But let's talk about the game.
It's a pretty straightforward game. I was digging up in a lot of wikis. Honestly, a lot of the information's a little surface level here, so I apologize. I don't have the super deep lore, but I thought this was kind of funny. So when the game was supposed to come out was mid 1992 Q2, but it seems like there were a lot of changes and issues with it. So visual changes, title, like title graphics. They were deciding whether they should call it Malibu Beach Volleyball or Malibu Bikini Volleyball. They settled on Malibu Bikini Volleyball because apparently there was a 1989 Game Boy game called Malibu Beach Volleyball, and it's maybe too generic. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it was for the NES too.
Yeah, it ended up pushing out the release almost a year, which, in old console or even handheld terms, that's an eternity. Nowadays, a system has a 7-8 year lifespan, but back then, we're on year 4, year 5 of the system. It's like, oof, it's getting long in the tooth. So probably didn't do as well as it could have, even though it's a fairly impressive looking game.
The game was developed by a small team with Oscar Green as the producer, Jim and Val Gregory serving as co-designers, Bill Barna and Rob Nicholson as programmers, artists Lee Cawley, Andy Gavin, and Michael McCallion. And finally, music and sound effects by Paul Tonge, with Kerry Takeki doing a bit of the voiceover for the game. There are a few little voices in there.
Yeah, when you press start, it's like, cool, stuff like that. You might want to try to see if you can pull it up for the show. It's, actually, the Lynx had some pretty good, for an 8-bit or whatever resolution the DAC was, you had some pretty decently clear audio clips in it.
8-bit DACs. 4 of them, independent. There's not a lot to talk about when we talk about the gameplay, though. It's a pretty straightforward volleyball game. Did you play it?
I did, yeah. I played it a decent amount, and by I played through maybe 2 rounds of the tournament. I think I won the first 15-point game, and then I lost this. Did you struggle with comeback?
Did you struggle with the timing at all?
I did, yeah.
Okay, in the beginning, I could not get the timing down. When you press the button, your character has this swinging motion that they do. It's kind of like if you're bumping or setting, it starts from their knees and they bring their hands up, so you have to time when the ball comes down that it connects correctly. It took me probably 15 minutes just to get the timing down, hit it once, and then once you get it kind of clicks and you're like, okay, I got this. But
yeah,
man,
it's pretty
was that
elaborate
tough.
Animation. It's I don't know, maybe 10 frames for your arms to go from your hips all the way up.
Too many frames.
Yeah. It's true.
Because I think going back, you were talking about Malibu Beach Volleyball for the Game Boy and I think NES, and I remember that game was almost instant. You press the button and it's bonk, and, so. Yeah,
it's a very simplistic. You have little Duplo block characters, and they pretty much hit instantly. This one's a lot more, that swing arc. On serves, too, can be a little tricky if you're not careful.
It's extremely tricky. There's some basic game modes, single player with 4 difficulty levels, friendly 1 through 4, and a tournament mode. Selectable options, you can change your match length with no limit, which is kind of cool because if you turn on no limit, you don't press any buttons, you can go through the whole soundtrack.
That's true.
Yeah, and I just did that in the background while I was working. A few different things 5-minute, 10-minute games, win strength, points to win. You can either do 10, 12, 15, and the volleyball speed from 1 to 9. I left it at 1 and I still struggled. So
yeah, I think I had it at whatever the default was, which I think
whatever the default was,
3 or 4. But I also I really appreciate that did include the wind speed thing, because if you feel like the game is getting too easy, having a little bit of randomness could be fun. I never really played with it. I didn't get solid enough on the game to introduce more chaos.
So there's also a guide, like this square, this kind of blinking square that tells you where the ball is going to land. I tried turning that off just to see after I'd gotten used to the controls. It's impossible. Like you have to know, like there's not enough screen real estate when the ball is in the air to know where you have to be. And, depth in that game, well, in a lot of 2D games is very difficult as it is. So I never messed with that, but
it's the depth of field is like there's a shadow on the ball, but it's often not enough. Like I think you need to be a little lower than you think you do for your hands to be to meet the ball. It's confusing, but I usually have the guide on.
Yeah, we're kind of like dumping all over this game, but it's actually not bad.
No, it takes some time
solid
to get
game,
used to. But honestly, it's a volleyball game. Like it's pretty straightforward. It's a volleyball game.
Yeah, and actually, I like volleyball games a lot. They're super fun. Anyways, so we got another track here. This is Bikini Beauty. Let's take a listen.
That was the track Bikini Beauty from Malibu Bikini Volleyball for the Atari Lynx.
Not entirely sure if it works for a volleyball game. It's a little too slow, but man, this track is so cool.
Yeah.
It's minimalistic and just like very just laying out, catching the sun, feeling the breeze.
Yeah, I was going to say, I definitely got sitting on the beach, watching the waves, maybe closer to sunset. Definitely not in the middle of a volleyball game, like
I know.
Drinking a cold one, you know?
Yeah. So one of the most unique features, and this is something you taught me, Gene, that I didn't know about at all, but we got to bring it up, is it's kind of like a tape deck or like a Walkman. If you press the option button on the Lynx, it'll bring up, like, while you're mid-game, you can select what track you want to listen to, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's really a very fully featured Walkman. So even though it's a Lynx,
it's more intricate than like half of the things in the game. It's really impressive.
Yeah, so I think the thing to stress is this game is very programmery in terms of like the options are right up front. It's very, granular, modular. You kind of change things. Same thing with the music. You can it's literally got the transport controls: play, pause, stop, next, previous, so you can go to the previous song, and even a fast forward, which simulates like skipping through the track a little bit more quickly. It's just like, why? It's there and it's kind of neat, but it seems a little funny.
I want to hear that breakdown.
Oh yeah, if you want to get to that specific part in track 3 or whatever it is. There are 10 tracks that you can select, but more interestingly and unnecessarily, there is a playlist you can manually create. So if you wanted to hear each song twice, there are 20 slots. So you can hear all 10 songs 2 times through, or randomize it.
However you want to set it. Yeah, it's again, way too intricate for. And plus, I never even knew it existed until you told me.
Somebody went ham on those controls.
Yeah. We got another track here. This is Beach Boy Blues. So let's take a listen.
That was the track Beach Boy Blues from the game Malibu Bikini Volleyball, and that was certainly a game in California. Sounds a lot like the BMX bike from that. I think about that soundtrack a lot. More than I should, because I grew up playing it a lot with friends. Pass the controller around.
I did as well. And it's funny because I didn't know the track name of this when I heard it. Because even that little tape deck thing, there's like no track names. There's track 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
No. There are track names. They're in there. Yeah.
Oh, are they?
Yeah.
Oh, I just
missed it. There's like a little fake LCD display. Like,
oh, I missed that part. What? That's why I was like, how did he figure out these names, these track names? Anyways, after I saw Beach Boy on there, I was like, all of a sudden that high note, I was imagining them, the Beach Boys singing it.
Harmonizing to it, yeah.
Yeah. Anyways.
We'll spare you.
Yeah. So, despite being 198 episodes in, we haven't really focused on the Lynx on this podcast yet. And so I did want to talk about the handheld itself because it's really unique and it was actually kind of leading the way, I think, in a lot of different ways. So it was released, it's a 16-bit handheld released by Atari in the summer of 1989, so very early. And it was the first handheld with a backlit color LCD, which had a 160 by 102 resolution. It was released shortly after the Game Boy, and it was pretty much different in every way, including the price. The Game Boy was released at $89, which is like $230 today. And the Lynx was $179, which is like $460 today. So I don't know how much tech they had to put into this. I do. I read the docs on it. But,
yeah, it was.
I mean, there's a reason why, but it's like double the price. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I love an underdog, and I obviously understand 100% why the Game Boy and even the Game Gear did significantly better than this thing. But honestly, when you play some of the games, especially the ones that are really pushing the hardware, it had a lot of cool stuff going for it. Like, it's not like, it should have done substantially better or anything, but like, just appreciating it for what it was.
I actually think it should have done better than it did. And I think the price point was a huge, a huge thing. And back then it was, you can either get your kids a Game Boy for Christmas, or for $100 or $89, or you can get the Lynx, which is, a huge battery suck for one. And also, twice the cost. Right.
Yeah.
So,
and over time, there weren't that many games that came out for it versus the Game Boy, which was just like hundreds and hundreds. Yeah,
exactly. But also think like, the Nintendo name itself helped sell the Game Boy.
Oh, yeah.
Kids already had an NES at home. So the Game Boy was like, Nintendo has a handheld. Like, okay, we'll just do that. So it was a familiar name. So that's why I think one of the reasons why it overshadowed the Lynx. I never personally owned one.
Same.
I had a friend who would bring it over all the time in the early 2000s, and they were pretty cheap. I remember I was thinking about getting one because, back on eBay when game prices were still like, retro games were like dirt cheap, probably like $25-$30 or something. I was like, I'll wait.
I'll pass.
Never picked one up. Yeah. Todd's Adventure in Slime World was pretty much one of my top games. Xenophobe, I love the NES version, so I wanted that. And California Games, of course, I wanted a handheld version of that. And Road Blasters, which Road Blasters was actually, I was looking this on Atari Age or Wikipedia, I forgot, but that was the most popular or most highly sold game, which, it's okay. It's kind of like it's just a racing game, I guess.
That's fair.
So,
especially the early stuff was a lot more like, Atari did have a pedigree and they had quite a few games that had come out in the arcades. So, and other systems as well. And I think this was a partnership with Epix, right? EPYX, the company that put out California games. So there's no surprise why I keep bringing it up. But for me, the only time I ever got a chance to play the Lynx in the wild, so to speak, was again, I had a friend that randomly had one, much like I had one friend that had a Master System, and I got to play Pit Fighter on it, which, playing a handheld version of a crappier version of Mortal Kombat was fine, I guess. It's not exactly a great game, but visually it looks nice. Color screen, big sprites or big digitized graphics. But as far as a gameplay experience, I'm like, I'll pass. I'm good.
But like I was saying earlier, the system, I think, helped pave the way for a lot of how we imagine modern handhelds today, like the Switch, Vita, Steam Deck. The displays centered in the unit between the D-pad and the buttons horizontally. You can, versus the vertical version of the vertical orientation of the Game Boy, you can flip the console upside down because it supports changing hand position. So you can play right-handed with a and B button, and then flip it around, have a D-pad, and then they have a mirrored A and B button for your thumb on the other side. It's really strange, but also pretty awesome to be able to do that. Really changes what you could do with games, right? So, yeah. Anyway, I thought that was pretty cool.
I think you can even play some games vertically, although not many took advantage of it. So it's like this very, very tall, like taller than the Game Boy when it's in that orientation. But
exactly, I will say, kind of like Wonder Swan if you've ever played one of those. Yeah,
everybody always gives credit to Nintendo for being a little bit creative and inventive or imaginative. But I got to say, they tried something. It didn't fully work, but it's cool. And I imagine Nintendo cribbed some ideas from it when they were getting a little further along. I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah, of course.
The system it's kind of like the Game Gear, but a little beefier, and not too heavy considering the tech. I mean,
yeah,
it's still, because you have so many batteries in there, it adds a lot to the weight. But 2 years later in 1991, Atari released an updated version referred to by most people, and especially in the gaming community, as the Lynx 2, since the silk screen on the motherboard was it had Lynx 2 on there.
Yeah,
Roman numeral 2. If I remember correctly, I think I was looking at the PCB at some point, but it was marketed as just the Lynx. So they slightly better hardware, design was a little more modern, even more compact, lighter, smaller, better battery life. Most importantly for us though, headphone jack, stereo headphone jack. So nice. They had a monorail one before, and on this new one they had a stereo headphone jack, which is pretty cool. Production stopped, however, in 1995, but combined, they sold about 2 million units. So it did, it sold pretty well compared to the Game Gear, which only sold about 10 million. And the Game Boy sold about 118 million. So maybe not as well.
I put those numbers in for scale because people always think of the Game Gear as kind of a failed system. And it's like, I don't know, 10 million units obviously sounds pretty lame compared to Game Boy, but man, 2 is hard.
I knew a lot more people with a Game Gear than with a Lynx. That's for sure.
Of course. Oh, yeah. The numbers don't lie. 5 times more people bought them. But
over 6 years, though, they released 71 games. There's, Clax, like you were mentioning, a lot of different ports and stuff.
Clax is great flags. On there, actually.
It is. Yeah. It's really good. Checkered Flag, Lemmings, Toki is really good on their Blue Lightning Chips Challenge. Paperboy was really good. Gauntlet, Shadow the Beast, Ninja Gaiden, Double Dragon, Rampage, Rygar. There was a bunch of ports. And again, I think that was some of the appeal too. You can play some of the games that you loved on the go, in the back of a car or whatever.
I still pop in this version of Chips Challenge from time to time. It's good. Like
it is good. It's good.
It's pretty basic, but it controls well. And it's like a perfect pick up and play sort of game. And the music's not amazing, but it's more interesting than the PC version, which I think is silence and just like a couple of like beeps and bloops or sound effects.
Yeah. Speaking of, we got another track here. This is called Spike, composed by Paul Tonge. That was Spike for Malibu Bikini Volleyball on the Atari Lynx. And this is just a slow jam. I love this track. It's a good one.
Yeah, absolutely one of my favorites on the soundtrack. I also like the first title track, Malibu Volleyball, but this one's just got those like pitch bends up are so satisfying. And the little arpeggiated thing that's going pretty much all the way through until it goes to halftime is like, it sets it up so perfectly. It's great.
Yeah, I want to talk about the sound hardware a little bit, and this is something that it was hard for me to really fully understand. I mean, I've kind of looked at it over the years and thought I had a good grasp of it, but I found the programmer's manual for this that they would send out to devs.
Nice.
And it's actually pretty comical. Like it's written in a very like
tongue-in-cheek sort of way, yeah.
Tongue-in-cheek, almost like disgruntled engineer. Like, here, I'll write the damn docs, right? Like, yeah. and there's a part in there, and they're like, "Look, I don't really care for sound, but we did this anyway." And it says more to sound, and it says, "What in the world were we thinking?" And this is directly from the manual, by the way. What in the world were we thinking when we designed the sound hardware? The original design goals were that the circuits, number 1, be cheap. 2, require relatively little CPU help to make useful game noises. 3, have sufficient range and accuracy for tolerable music. Sounds good, right?
Right.
4, have 4 channels, right? And remember, a lot of the Amiga folks kind of were involved in this kind of stuff too, or a lot of the Atari folks. Number 5 has direct access to the DACs. And number 6, be cheap. And so you could see kind of like how this manual is laid out. And their approach was similar to the Atari 800 or the 2600 sound system. The sound engine itself is part of the CMOS chip, and it has 4 channels, completely identical channels, digitally mixed and sent to the analog filter. Each audio channel consists of a programmable bass frequency, a programmable polynomial sequence generator, a wave selector, and a programmable volume control. Essentially 4 channels of 8-bit DAC or PSG. So yeah, 8-bit DAC for each channel, 4 channels times 8 bits. Channels, 32 bits. And these 4 sound channels can also be switched in analog sound mode to generate PSG sound.
Something I want to really talk about, though, is, there's kind of that technical talk. But I think one thing that's really hard to capture, and actually this...
Are you blowing off my talk, dude?
No. This soundtrack doesn't actually do a good job of showcasing it, but the Lynx is really good at making weird sounds, like periodic noise, squelchy little things. It's cool. Like, I've actually had some opportunity to play around with it. What is it called? Furnace Tracker, my favorite. I love that.
It's my favorite software. Too. It's really good. Yeah.
It's, you can play around with almost every old hardware chip you can think of and make music with it. And once you kind of get the hang of the Lynx, it's very different from the Game Boy. I mean, like, yes, roughly the same vintage and same era, and you can kind of make some similar sounds. But the philosophy behind the whole Atari line of chips, going back to the whatever the TIA chip is and the Pokey, and then ultimately this one, it's just everything is like noisier. I don't know how to put it. It's just like, digital, like you could do periodic noise on the NES, but like in a very limited way. Imagine like 50 different ways to generate periodic noise. It's a cool little sound chip. I got to give some props to it.
Yeah, it's really directly tied to the CPU as well. So they have this system called polynomial counter, which basically every cycle gets to hit the audio engine as well. And so you can make some really interesting stuff with it, or you can write your own sound driver and talk directly to the DAC. So I think that, it's weird that it's part of like Furnace Tracker, because you could just make these sounds yourself. For the most part, right?
I mean, they do a good job of emulating the restrictions in terms of like the bit limitations, and on that note, I did want to bring this up because I know people on the internet love to argue about these silly kinds of things. It's technically an 8-bit CPU, even though it has a 16-bit graphics processor, because For some reason, people get weird about like, oh, is it an 8-bit or a 16-bit system? And it's
those numbers like don't really matter.
They don't mean
much.
anything. But, more color depth and that sort of thing.
The Atari Jaguar, 64-bit, man.
128 bits, right? Whatever. The numbers started to get silly. But since we didn't mention it up top, I did want to call out that one of the things that was really forward-thinking and perhaps what contributed to the cost was the hardware scaling. So you could have essentially like a pseudo mode 7 or super scaler type graphics on the Lynx, which really, I think, Todd's Adventure in Slime World does this a lot. You have all these like shifting.
That's one of the things I love. Cool.
The Game Boy smartly didn't do it because it would have probably brought the cost of the chip up a lot, but I'm glad somebody went for it.
There's a lot of impressive tech that went into some of the thought process. The CPU, the main CPU in the system is called Mikey. That's its nickname. And they put a lot of time. Reading the tech docs is really interesting because they talk about the development process too. Even for the developers, it's really strange, but it was a good read if this is the kind of stuff you like to nerd out to. We'll put a link in the show notes, I think, for anybody that might be interested. For some reason, I have a feeling that like Utopia Nemo is going to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to go read that on my lunch break.
Yeah, no, I sometimes read the OPL documentation, believe it or not.
Yeah.
I don't know why I find that such a fun read. Don't mind me.
Mikey.
We should get into some more music.
Mikey. Oh yeah, I didn't mention the co-processor was called Susie.
The Amiga also had the Paul chip, and loved it.
Anyways, let's get into our next track. What do we got?
On the Shoreline.
That was On the Shoreline, composed by Paul Tonge for Malibu Bikini Volleyball on the Lynx.
Nice. So I really, really enjoyed that song, especially when it sort of mellows out towards the back half. You wouldn't expect a game like this to have so much calming, relaxed music. And
I don't think the people listening to this could see your chef's kiss on that one, but yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I actually broke up this next section into two parts. Typical ADD stuff. I start off writing about Paul Tonge, and then I end up going off on a tangent. So this first one is more about the company he kept rather than the stuff about him, and then the next one's about Paul more specifically. But Paul Tonge is an English musician. He was active starting in the late 80s. He worked a lot through the 90s and even a little bit in the early 2000s as a games musician. He's good friends with Tony Williams and Tony Williams' company Sound Images, which I slandered in our episode about X-Men Arcade's Revenge, Spider-Man and X-Men Arcade's Revenge.
No, we both did.
Paul was not the guy. It was, I think, Tony or the other guy who did that one. So you're in the clear, Paul. But I think this was really interesting because Software Creations was one of these companies that was, the games industry wasn't exactly super friendly to original games in the console world in the UK in the early 90s. So they were mostly porting houses. And Software Creations, was one of those companies. Paul Tonge left Sound Images to join Software Creations because there's, a lot of like contract work. But what I think is interesting about that company is just how many heavy hitters in, UK, British Isles that work there, many names that we know very well. Jeff and Tim Fallon, David Whitaker, David Wise, did like a couple of games for them outside of Rare when it was more doing contracting type stuff. Alistair Brimble, of course, Paul Tonge and Tony Williams as part of Sound Images. Some names that aren't as familiar, but some of these guys are still working in the industry today, like Martin Goodall, Chris Jojo, James Hannigan, who I learned was a BAFTA winner, worked on Dead Space 3 and Command & Conquer Red Alert 3, Matthew Cannon, Peter Clark, and Sudi Raval, who also worked on a lot of like Lego games, Harry Potter games. A lot of these credits are very recent. So I just thought that was like, it's this really cool collection of people in what is otherwise kind of like a middling company that just made a lot of, but it was a way for people to get their foot in the door in the industry and for some of these guys and really spread their wings. So that was really cool. And I also wanted to just call out some other folks. We don't talk about these guys nearly enough, but Martin Walker, Mike Webb, Neil Millstone, and Stephen Ruddy, all of these guys were composers and sound driver programmers. Much love, much respect to folks that actually spend the time to write these sound drivers and allow musicians and composers to do the work that they do. Many of them wrote their own drivers, but they would often also send them out to folks to use, in the games and software creation. So I don't need to be super specific, but they wrote drivers for things like Super Nintendo games, GBA games, and just for various consoles. But I feel like we always talk about the composers, and sometimes we don't talk enough about the people that do the work behind the scenes. So,
well, no, I'll challenge you on that one. I think in this show we do.
In this show we do. Yes,
yes,
we do.
They deserve a little more street cred, I guess, like amongst the community. So yeah, we should bring them up. Anyways, we have a track here. This is Banana Volley. So let's take a listen. That was Banana Volley, composed by Paul Tonge.
There's so much lovely sound design in this game. It's subtle, it's understated, but it's just very, very pleasant. Like, you know, I've definitely heard lots of, I don't know, classic maximalist chiptune stuff, you know, on the C64 and some of these systems. But sometimes lovely works, you know? I really enjoy the sonic atmosphere in this game a lot.
This is one of those soundtracks. It's not for everybody, but I think there's a lot
to like. But yeah,
there's
I
a lot of listeners out there who are just loving it. I know it.
I hope so. Yeah,
I'm talking about you guys, all of you. All right. So,
Paul Tonge.
Paul, yeah. So
yeah, that's quite a lot actually. Paul is definitely one of these, like, you know, mercenary types. If you need him to do something, he could do it. So he worked as a composer, he worked as a sound designer, he worked as a sound programmer, he worked as a sound driver programmer. Just, you know, really, really versatile guy. We sometimes, I think in this show more than many others, you know, everybody's like, oh, I love Nobuo Uematsu, and we do too. But I really also love highlighting folks that are just a little bit undersung, right? And Paul, I think, we played one of his tracks way back when on the celebrity sports game, Jimmy Connor's Tennis, and I've wanted to come back to his music for some time. So I was really happy to dig into this, even though he probably won't, you know, shout his own praises super much. But he started off in the early days, in the late 80s, doing, you know, very simple ports to Commodore 64 and Amiga. Later on, he worked on a lot of handhelds and, of course, the big systems of the time, Super Nintendo and Genesis. Later on, he would work on like Jaguar and certain things like that. Some of his earliest works, I know some of these, I don't know all of them, but on the C64, he worked on this game called Demon's Kiss, Xenon, which I do know, Narc, Pro Mountain Bike Simulator. And then, as I mentioned, he worked with Tony Williams, and they created the company Sound Images to do music conversions. So kind of like a more official unit, so they could start getting more licensed work. And then this is kind of very messy. It's sometimes sound images, sometimes software creation, so I'm not going to be super accurate with this. But he went on to work on a number of games, I think many of which you have either heard of or played. Foreman for Real, which was on various systems, Game Boys, Super Nintendo, Game Gear, Genesis. He wrote with Chris Jojo. The Tick for Super Nintendo. I played that one a decent amount, even though it's not that great of a game.
I played that too. It isn't that great, but yeah.
I'd say his big, like, original album, and this is super deep cut, only if you've been playing games as long as we have, Tinhead on the Genesis. That's kind of his big claim to fame. It's not a port, it's not a licensed game. It was an original, like, platformer with some, you know, pretty cool dancing music, which had an unreleased Super Nintendo version, which I can see why it was unreleased. Everything about it is kind of underbaked. You know, the soundtrack's not there, the graphics are a little bit glitchy. It was you know, not far enough along. He also worked on 2 Rugrats games with Martin Goodall, who you mentioned up earlier, for Game Boy and Game Boy Color. And also, you might appreciate this, he worked on the unreleased Super Nintendo game Barbie Vacation Adventure. Soundtrack also isn't that great on that one, but I looked it up. You can find it on YouTube today. He was a music director on a couple of games. You know these ones, I think. Spider-Man and Venom, Maximum Carnage, and Separation Anxiety. I thought those were really fun little beat-em-ups.
Yeah.
And Cutthroat Island, which he didn't write the music for. I believe that was, let me pull up his name. I think that was James Hannigan who wrote that one. But he was the music director on that. And I'm going to pause there because I don't want to keep talking about lists. I want to let you jump in and talk about some stuff.
Oh, I was just daydreaming anyway. Says, all right.
see, I don't want our listeners to tune out too much.
I was just picturing.
Games, right?
I was just picturing, like, I was still thinking about the Tick for Super Nintendo. He's done a lot of stuff. And Cutthroat Island, I'm trying to remember what that. I'm vaguely remembering something, but I don't know if I'm mixing it with Hook or something like that.
Yeah, I was gonna say there was like because of the movie Hook, there was like this little string of like pirate fantasy Robinson Crusoe type games that came out where it was like ragtag bunch of people. You were like barely a pirate. You were like a guy that ran with pirates, like in Hook or Cutthroat Island or whatever. Actually, that was a movie, I believe, Cutthroat Island. I only vaguely remember it. Was that Julia Roberts? Am I remembering that correctly?
Maybe that's why I'm thinking like, huh?
Let me look that up. Yeah, it's Julia Roberts and no, Gina Davis.
Gina Davis.
Yes,
like one of the same
contemporary. And Matthew Modine. Yeah, I guess.
Oh yeah, I know this. Yeah.
Nothing to do with Waterworld, which we covered extensively. Do you want to take a little musical break here? I got a little bit more to go.
Yeah, we just did Banana Volley, and there's also Beach Volley. So let's take a listen to that one. This one's it's soft and slow. I don't really the melody's kind of like phoned in to me.
Yeah, it's probably not my favorite track for sure.
Yeah, it's not my favorite track, but the still it's still like a nice mellow kind of more of a sunset kind of thing than like a volleyball game. But hey, you know, there's a lot of really great tracks in the soundtrack. This isn't one of the ones I would repeat. It wouldn't go into my tape deck playlist.
Oh yeah, you could cut this one out easily. Just skip straight from track 7 to 9. Screw track 8. No, it's fine. Like, it's a totally good song. Like I said, it's not bad. It's just compared to some of the other ones we've heard, it's a little less interesting. But it's fine. You can't win them all, Paul. If you're listening out there,
he's probably that's my favorite track. You guys are dumping on.
I did want to bring up this, which, you know, I mentioned that he was really versatile. He was working as a composer. He was working as a music director. Like, you know, obviously in the early days of the game industry, he kind of just did the job. Somebody's like, did it all, we need a music director for this. Can you do it? Like, yeah. I thought what was interesting is he started off, like many other composers, using other people's sound drivers. I was reading his, what is it called? One of the video game wikis. And it was like, started off using somebody else's driver. Then for another game, during the Super Nintendo era, he was using Mike Webb's sound driver, which he then modified and then licensed to DMA Design, which we now know as Rockstar, I believe. If I'm remembering my history correctly, that was the Lemmings company that went on to do Rockstar down the road. During the N64 era, he developed his own tools. He's also credited as one of the music programmers for Mario Artist Paint Studio for N64 DD in 1999. We talked about how Nintendo is a little bit, they sort of go back and forth on when they outsource some of their software development work to I would say Japanese developers. We have like Star Fox and things, and then they kind of
more
like
common. Yeah, it's more common these days, right?
Yeah, but like that tells you he's probably pretty good if he was one of the sound programmers for this. Like the Mario Artist games were these incredibly elaborate, like, you know, Mario Paint X10, right? Yeah. So there was probably some pretty interesting, you know, like dynamic audio stuff, as much as you could in '99 on the. You know,
I remember
N64.
we went through the Mario Artist soundtrack. I remember there being a lot of stuff in there.
Oh, it's so weird. Yeah, those soundtracks are really cool. They're like really out there. Like some of them are almost sound experimental kind of things. Others are, you know, tuneful and pretty enjoyable. But yeah, there's also tons of music in those games. Mario, there's two big ones. I can't remember what the other one was. There's the Mario Paint Studio and another one, and they have like hours of music on them, and it's like almost feels unnecessary to have that much, but they're a little bit of a, not a hidden treasure because people in our community know about them, but there's a lot of stuff to be mined from there. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. During the Game Boy years, which spanned a decade, right? He developed his own sound drivers, which were used by other, based on the context, probably sound or software creations folks. And those sound drivers were later used by other game studios like Warthog Games and Z2, which were both had other X software creation staff on them. They weren't huge studios by any means, but they were both UK-based studios that went on to make their own games. And, you know, they all scatter to the winds, and some of them continue in the games industry. And then finally, the last two games that he worked on were for the Game Boy Advance. He worked on Dexter's Lab, Chess Challenge, and Samurai Jack, the Amulet of Time in 2002 and 2003. So he retired from the game industry, but he was in for about 15 years. He did some good work. He should be proud.
Did a lot of work, you know?
Yes,
like
work, not just music.
Yeah. So, you know, again, back then, you know, you got hired as a sound person, and that just kind of was all of the above, right?
Yeah.
Now, and I think I've mentioned this on many episodes in the past, but, you know, now it's like there's a dedicated role for like every, you know, micro piece of a title. And back then, you know, it was kind of, you just do all of the above. So if the tools suck, guess what? You made them, so blame yourself. You know? So, yeah. Anyways, we got another track here. This is SandOut, and we'll take a listen. That was SandOut, composed by Paul Tonge, and I really like this track. It's kind of mysterious and spacey, but like kind of soul food for your ears, I guess.
Yeah, and I don't say this in like a cute sort of way, but like the lack of percussion was a bold choice, because I think there's almost always a pressure in video games to make something with a beat. Not all video games do this, but in a game like this, you could imagine all of the songs would be very like, driving. And this one just kind of carries you off. It's very dreamy. It's very like, I think both Brian and I were drifting off a little bit just listening to it. Like, oh, this is really, really pleasant.
I was trying to think SandOut. What would that be? Would that be like out of bounds?
Yeah,
because,
yeah. That's what happens.
Okay,
when,
because like, I mean, I played volleyball, but I never played beach volleyball. Like, like, I don't know, competitively or anything. So, I mean, the whole beach is sand. So there's sand in and sand out.
Well, I mean, there's the bounds drawn, like a tennis court, right? It's a giant rectangle
out of. So it's like court out, but like sand.
Yeah, exactly. Out. Yeah, okay. Except instead of clay, it's sand.
All right. I'm just trying to understand this.
I've run out of things to say about the game, but we do have one more track before we have two more tracks. But
we ran out of things to say probably 20 minutes ago. This is SkyBall. Let's take a listen.
That was the track SkyBall from the game Malibu Bikini Volleyball, composed by Paul Tonge. Sounds a lot like David Whittaker to me. Kind of reminds me of that.
Yeah, that background channel. It's really faint and it has the arpeggiated runs that kind of go up and down. It's really pretty. I like that.
It's
cool track. Yeah. Man, we saved the most mellow ones for last. I had no percussion either.
Yeah. I mean, that one was a little bit more driving just because of the quick 16th note runs. But yeah, it's similar in that it genuinely feels laid out like an album, right? Like there is a flow to the tracks, and they make sense because you're using it as like a little Walkman. So there was some thought put into the track order because for whatever reason in this game you actually have that luxury. Like in most games it's designed, in a certain kind of order, but it's like,
I mean, we always get excited when there's like a sound test or something, right? But like when you have like that little extra effort put into it, clearly showcasing the music, right? Then they had some love there. That's cool. Anyways,
the sound test was incorporated directly into the game as if you were choosing the music. So like
exactly
that kind of attention to detail rarely comes up, but it's really cool when it happens.
Right. So today we covered Malibu Bikini Volleyball on the Atari Lynx, composed by Paul Tonge. If you want to know more about the show, you can check us out online at pixelatedaudio.com for the show notes, track lists. I'll make sure I put those tech docs in the show notes. And please join us on Discord. It's always a good time. Yeah. Lots of friends. Always relaxing.
If discussing the Atari Lynx brings you joy, join our Discord and talk about it with us. It brings me joy. There is some really genuinely great music on this thing. Blue Lightning has really good music for such an early game. It was like a launch title, basically.
Yeah.
It sounds really good.
If you like the show and you want to check out some of our past episodes, we just did one on Blades of Steel for the NES and Game Boy. We mentioned the N64 and PlayStation tracks, but listen to it for the other ones. We did teeny golf games with Hammock and celebrity sports games. That was episode 118. We've done, I don't even know how many sports games at this point, but a lot. Go back and listen.
There's a lot of great music in sports games. They get slept on, but somebody put in a lot of hard work, especially in the ones that we highlight. There are sports games with like one song that's half baked, but we don't usually cover those.
What was the tennis game that we
Rackets
covered?
and Rivals.
And Rivals.
Yeah, that one also had a really good little soundtrack and completely out of left field. It's basically like Gradius, but for tennis.
Yeah. Anyways, we got our final track here, composed by Paul Tonge. It's called Winners. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you back in a few weeks for the next episode. Gene, you've got a VGM Con, right?
That's right. Yes, we are recording this just a few days before I go off to VGM Con. So we have another show. Those of you that remember, we did a show last year at VGM Con, which was all about Midwest VGM. Very broad air quotes on that because I went on a whole bunch of weird tangents. I'm doing it again, but this time about space. So should be a fun time. I've got Pernell from Rhythm and Pixels and Carlos from Heroes 3 podcast joining me. Both active members of various Discord communities, both great guys. Really excited to have them join me and riff with me up on stage. They were with me on the previous episode at VGM Con last year, which was, I think, episode 190. Yeah, I think it was episode 190. I got to play I Am Bread on that one, so that's a win for me, I guess. No, for nobody else.
All right. Again, track taking us out as winners. Thank you so much for listening. See you back in a few weeks for the next episode.